Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue à ce séminaire.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the seminar on extractivism, ecology, and food. And so this seminar is organized with the HOMEF Health of Mother Earth Foundation, founded by Nnimmo Bassey, who's our special guest for this third edition of the festival. So there are three topics, and we'll deal with these three sessions today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. And so we'll talk about food independence and the legacy of colonialism, and we'll finish with green colonialism and its notion. And so we'll talk about these different topics with various guests and various participants, and the link between all these topics with colonialism. And so the question today is, who feeds the world? So this session will be moderated by Nnimmo Bassey and myself. And so we have Arthur Grimonpont here with us, and he is a special engineer in urban planning. We have Muriel Mambrini-Douzet and Mamadou Goïta, based in Bamako in Mali, and Mariam Maye, based in Johannesburg, South Africa. So, Nnimmo, please, if you'd like to introduce the session before giving the floor to our participants, please.
Thank you very much. I welcome all participants and I welcome all the panelists to this session. This is a very unique session we're about to have. Who feeds the world? This is a question that everybody needs to really reflect on, because there are a lot of ideas floating around about who actually feeds the world. And when we define, the way we define who feeds the world also directly translates to who gets support to feed the world and what kind of approach is taken to food production and what kind of food ends up on our dining tables. What is the implication of what we have, and what is, so there are so many questions around it. Just by answering this question, who feeds the world, we'll get to speak about many things. And today we have a very, very distinguished four panelists whose names have already been mentioned. And we are looking forward to having very intensive discussions concerning what is food and who produces food. Must food be standardized? Must food be genetically engineered? There are many questions I could ask personally, and which we are going to, when we get to the brainstorming session, the question session with the speakers, we'll have the opportunity of both the participants and also those of myself and Lucas also asking questions to our speakers. I believe we have, our speakers have done a lot of work on the question. A brother like Mamadou Goïta is the executive director of the Institute for Research and Promotion of Alternatives in Development, based in Bamako, Mali. So the name of his organization already tells us a lot about what he will probably be talking about today. This is researching and promoting alternatives. And I would also like to hear about a lot of work that's gone on in Mali concerning food production. And then Mariam Maye from South Africa, one of the foremost activists on food issues in Africa and probably in the world. She's the executive director of the Africa Center for Biodiversity. I look at her as the police person of food on the continent, because she looks at what kind of food is coming to the farmer, what seeds are coming to the farmers, who is trying to control the seeds on the continent, what kind of food do we get to eat, and is it wholesome, and what kind of the politics around food, around seed. And so we really, her competence and expertise and knowledge are enormous, and we look forward to hearing from her. So I'll hand it back to you, Lucas, to introduce the first speaker.
Merci. Alors Arthur Grémontpont, je vous propose de prendre quelques minutes pour présenter un tableau général de la situation par rapport à ce qui est votre
Well,
travaux et notamment
Arthur, could you please introduce us with your work and the specific context of food resilience? Well, thank you very much for this introduction, and I'm pleased to get to know all the participants, even though it's in a virtual way. Just to give you a brief introduction of what I do, I focus on food resilience and on the food system. That's to say, everything that allows us to get food on our table. And so this food system can be perceived as the first lever to global change, one of the first lever of the Anthropocene. And these are the vital activities that might be most directly concerned or threatened by our activities. And so there's an article published by Mr. Campbell seeks to and shows the 10 worldwide limits that were defined and proposed by the Stockholm Resilience Center with Johan Rockström. And they're trying to see the impact of agricultural production. And so there are 4 to 5 that are already out of date, and so the integrity of the biosphere, and so the chemical cycles of nitrogen, for instance, and phosphorus. And so amongst the 5 limits that were overstepped, the first cause, agriculture is the first cause of these elements. And so agricultural production that is necessary to producing food. And if we focus on biodiversity, because of the scale and the pace at which some species are extinguishing, we can see that agriculture is responsible of around 80% of deforestation. This is not related to demographic expansion, but because of extractivism and the agro industry, and because of soy farming, and because of palm oil in other parts of the world. And this destroys forests, and these stocks, these oxygen stocks are being gradually destroyed. And so this is gradually destroying biodiversity. And if we take the case of insects, and we can even see it around us in Europe, and we can see that from 50 to 66% of insects are disappearing. So that's an eradication. And we can see that 3/4 of everything that's grown on the planet depend on insects and on pollination. And being able to face pests is also something that we need to understand. And so to understand these limits, we can see that symmetrically agriculture is also problematic and is the cause of some direct aggravation factors. And these negative impacts have consequences on the agro-food system such as it is today. So we could talk about this and the impact of climate change on food and on agriculture, and on the Mekong Delta and the Nile. We can see that 7 billion people depend on these rivers. All of these resources are being endangered because of these evolutions. We depend on the system, and on fossil fuels, but you need to slow down a little bit so that the interpreters can convey your message. I'm sorry, I'm going to try and slow down as much as possible. Concerning oil, all of our food system was organized as if it were free and limitless, and especially in industrialized countries. So for instance, in France, there are around 30,000 trucks that go through France every day to distribute food, whereas at the end of the 19th century, except some electrical trains, we didn't need any means of transportation to just to eat. So it's difficult to imagine what our food system would be like if our resources, our energy resources, were limited, and it's something that we're going to go through for sure. So that was for the introduction, and I'll get back to other subjects later. Well, Nnimmo, if you agree with this, I can ask a question. Well, did you learn anything from the pandemic and the vulnerability of the agricultural systems that we use, and especially in the richest countries, we've been able to have access to all the products that we needed? Do you have another approach to this? Well, as we work on the resilience of the food system, this is a question that we very often get. Some people who believe that we should stick to the system in place say that that despite this pandemic, we've been able to eat normally almost, except for some products in supermarkets. But this shows that there's a kind of resilience in the way the food system is organized today. But this term, this word resilience, is used for many purposes, and sometimes a little bit too much. And depending on the type of threats that I've just mentioned, climate change, fossil fuels that won't be available in the future, and this will be even stronger than what we've experienced in 2020. However, there's a vision, a Western world-centered vision. We've understood it. A lot of people use around 8 million of food banks. We went from 6 to 8. So a lot of people have had to go through these systems to get food. We are talking about food precariousness here. And the FAO released the worldwide food program, the World Food Program. in order to tackle these issues. And so the plan is that hunger and starvation is probably going to soar in the next few years, whereas the trend had been had shown that it was reducing over the last years. And because of the consequences of the crisis, it's increasing again.
Nnimmo, est-ce que vous voulez réagir également ou on donne la parole à un second intervenant?
Okay, Lucas and Arthur, thank you so much for the conversation. Maybe we should go to another speaker, then we can come back at the end with questions for the various speakers. Right? Maybe we'll hand the floor over. Thank you so much, Arthur. There are many questions already, I know, from what you've said. I believe the other speakers will respond to some of your preliminary thoughts. But maybe we can invite now Muriel Mambrini-Duret to take the floor.
Muriel, c'est à vous.
Muriel, you've got the floor. Thanks a lot. I'm very happy to be here with you now. So what I've tried is to share some thoughts in order to open up an area of proposals and actions. So it seems interesting to me as a starting point for this work, going to the roots of resource exploitation, to begin by breaking down the issue to explore. So who feeds the planet? So I will begin by feed, not because that this is how the question begins. Rather, it begins with who and what who. I would like to consider at the end of my speech. And I could also have taken the question backwards. Who does the planet feed? So if we look at feeding, because I want to remind you that I'm a nutritionist, I feed you, feed, he feeds, we'll feed a neighbor. It's the minimal attention principles, the minimal responsibility towards what makes life at our side or what depends on us. And certainly what we expect in return is a form of bond, a minimum of recognition, if not attention, to be taken care of or nourished in return. So the who feeds the planet expects something in return. But never mind, I said I care about the who at the end of my speech. So to feed means to provide the ingredients necessary for life, which will be metabolized by the person who receives the food and will grow. That person will grow, and once grown will live. And it is also providing the necessary resources. Feeding is nourishing. It is also training, educating, maintaining, and laying down what will grow and live. This is feeding. And this is what makes, eventually, everyone knows and has received from their parents and their environment. And this is what echoes everyone's responsibility towards each other and mine as a researcher. And as a researcher and nutritionist, my tendency will be to deploy an analytical facet. I focus on this food on the one hand, and on the needs of the living organism that is going to receive it on the other. And I will see what I can change. So does it meet the global needs in proteins, energy, vitamins, mineral? What is its balance of nutriment? Can imbalances be compensated for? And are there other elements that can affect proper use and the metabolism? And I would like to keep in mind these 4 questions, because when we speak about the planet, we will get back to that. But this form of evaluation is never enough. In fact, I'm talking about feeding and not nourishing. And I have to see what happens upstream and probably downstream, and to pay a little more attention to the fact that this living organism is actually fed, nourished, has its own environment, habits, and choices. So if I were to become an economist and see how the food is produced, distribution, quality, economy is always challenging. I will identify the flows of resources, the financial flows, the influences, and all the regulations, what we call the food environment. An environment organized into chains, more or less integrated, complex, some of them very historical, because the beginning of the chain is almost before our eyes every day, if we take care. It is the land, the nourishing land, and those who cultivate it. The other link in the chain, which is often considered outside of the chain, is us, the one who is nourished, his culture, his taste, his free will, even if it is to be cultivated. Let's go back to the who at one end of the chain to say that the place of agriculture, the farmer, has changed significantly in recent years, is weak in the face of the changes that have taken place in this world of entrepreneurs and innovators. These professions, which both control and are enslaved to nature, have combined the long time of natural cycles and the acceleration of modernity, ancestral knowledge, and the latest research results. To be convinced of this, one only has to revisit the history of agriculture. Agriculture has intensified with the Industrial Revolution, diversified with the technological revolution, and entered a new form of competitiveness with globalization. The objective of feeding a growing population can be translated as follows. Since 1960, the population has been multiplied by 3 and has 20% more calories per person. But what does this really mean? We know that this is based on innovations, public policies, and private actors, and also private actors. So, as the former guest said, it is at the heart of the environment issues, the evolution of demography, climate, rare resources. In 2008, the World Bank had chosen agriculture as a main point, and we were happy because it was focused on. In 2009, the World Economic Forum in Davos placed food risk as an emerging risk. And what about today? The zero hunger objective is one of the 17 objectives of sustainable development. Somebody who is hungry, the number of hungry people after going down is once again rising slowly since 2015. So now with 135 million more people are at risk. So who is really feeding the planet? It is during crisis that we are reminded that agricultural production is the basis of our food supply. And I'm talking about agricultural production and productions. I'm inviting people to distinguish between them. And I'm also talking about farmers, a profession that isn't really attractive. It's a difficult job. You make little money, and you live quite poorly. Their specifications have evolved a lot. Natural resource management and rural development are in line with food and economic imperatives. Even if the diversity of agriculture is increasing, it is a whole organization, sector, advice, training, education, and social and collaborative networks, a social image that is entering a transition. What can be the new social contract of this whole ecosystem? We are working on this with the actors, but no doubt the question you're asking will help us. Meeting the challenges of competitiveness, social progress, and quality by integrating the ethical dimension means changing practices and ways of seeing a real upheaval in the core of the professions of agriculture. I would like to say that we're in transition towards systems that are more in tune with the planet, but transition on the one hand and system vision on the other hand lead to vulnerability in the effective design logic asserted as such as the beginning of the industrial era based on a rational simplification of processes. I would like this transition to be an affirmation of the recognized roles of agriculture in all regions of the world. The list of orders that I could make at each level of the system, but there will still be missing something, real changes in philosophy. We need to work on them, philosophies unbounded by power, discrete philosophies. I'll give you a perception of it. I'd like to tackle the other part of the question, the planet. As you have seen, where feeding has taken me, as being a nutritionist, I could not help but mobilize the political spaces and finally point out our lack of framework to think differently. This is what this subject inevitably leads to. So I propose to pose myself, for the time of the end of my talk, as the nutritionist of the planet. What do I do to feed it? Knowing that we know the recipes, as I was saying, when it was necessary to accelerate the means of feeding the world, we were able to mobilize innovations, public policies and private actors. So as a nutritionist researcher on the planet, I break it down. What are its global needs in ingredients? And moreover, can we list the essential ingredients? What is its balance in nutrients? Can we compensate for imbalances? What elements can affect proper use, the impact on the health of the planet, if you will? Can they limit the nutritional value? Are there elements that will affect the good use by the planet? And by this good use, I mean what can be anticipated from formulas and models, and what is known about human nature and its behaviors, actors with a chemical formula and the principles of biochemistry. If we want to go further, if we feed the planet, who does the planet feed in return? We had to go into space to really realize how much our representations could limit our capacity to understand and act. Since it will be difficult for us or take time, I propose to put the planet on its own channel, its own universe system, and to come back to what each of us does and considers to feed the planet. Because in the end, there will be no discrete philosophy without a shared vision, without nuances, without sharing questions, doubts, risk-taking, without defining the missions of each other at all levels of the production chain, including public and private interests. This is not a natural movement. Far from it. It is for the moment activated by visionaries or convinced people. It must be said that we can no longer rely solely on the initiatives of convinced individuals, nor on the contrary can we instantaneously tackle great federative objectives invented from outside. This requires tools, a methodology, and seen from the planet, the dividing lines between rural and urban, between protected areas and cultivated areas are tenuous. Thinking no longer means sticking to complexity, but saying to ourselves that there, at one point, if we are rigorous, what we do has value, a generic value, and there is really something to be done. So, will we feed the planet, which will in turn feed the planet? This is maybe the position we can have in order to tackle all these questions. I want to remind all the people who are listening live, they can ask questions on all the social networks used by the Urban School, and at the end of this seminar we'll dedicate time to answer these questions. So Nnimmo, in order to go on with what you said, maybe we can give the floor to Mamadou Goïta for a third presentation. If you agree with this.
Thank you very much, Nnimmo. I will speak in French, so I'm at home now. Donc, je vais parler en français.
So we'll speak French. As we have interpreters, I hope I can be heard. Very well. So thanks a lot for inviting me to take the floor. Thank you, Nnimmo. You're a fantastic person. I've had the honor to speak, to work with you on different subjects, and I'm looking forward to hearing you. I think this issue has been well described by the former two guests, and this is definitely the question we have to think about. And I will try to give a context to what I'm about to say, because this question made me think of different types of interpretation. Who feeds the planet? People living on the planet. How can we guarantee this basic need the best possible way? This is my way of understanding it, one way. Also speaking about the content, this planet, what does the content need in order to be satisfied regarding the daily meals? We can also think about cultures. And the second part of the question is who feeds the planet as the context that is being destabilized, imbalanced, and that won't be able to hold on for a long time. So I think it's important to remind you of a series of important points, because we are speaking of concepts related to the worldwide food system. Food sovereignty. Why are we speaking about this? Because we've understood that in the framework of the criteria, the food criteria, we had an approach where some players started saying, give us the means, the policies in order to feed the rest of the world. Multinational companies that thought that they could feed the whole planet, not only the whole planet as a framework, but also to feed the people. I was in '86 at the FAO with the Via Campesina, and the message sent was just buy our food, we will feed you. But the point was just let us feed ourselves. So a lot of people said, no, we don't agree with this offer from multinationals. Socially, culturally, economically, we want to decide what we eat, how we eat, and with whom we have to cooperate in order to eat. Who will accompany us, who will support us, and who will benefit from the food system. So it's a vision from upstream to downstream. We have to be coherent. So the production mode shouldn't be disconnected from the valuation mode and transformation mode, and also the fundamental question of the market. What market are we speaking about? So if products cannot flow, how can we have a sustainable production? So access to production resources, I mean water, I mean earth, I mean seeds, resources, whether they're public or private, how all this is organized in order to make sure that we can go on with a production of this type with increasing number of people in order not to have an imbalanced planet and to be contained by the planet. So production system, the way we use resources downstream, how can we organize with transformation and situation of these products? These are basic elements we have to analyze. So historically, we felt that imbalance was coming.
So there's been a kind of temptation from certain kind of stakeholders to divide things in several parts, and so part of them wanted to get the right just to make money, to speak in a straightforward way, and try to attack this diversity that we mentioned before, the diversity of food systems. So this has been a huge turn. And so we need to reshape the way we design this food system politically and to integrate them in our territories and to merge them with our cultural diversity. And of course, there are statistics, important statistics that can answer that question, showing that when we draw a link between the production system and the transformation of everything that's related to markets, when we draw a link between these two elements, there are two categories of markets. There's the worldwide, the global market, that is related with the global value chain, etc., and that showed that it only corresponds to 30% of what we eat. And I think there are statistics that show today that less than 30% of the quantity, the global quantity of the food market goes through this system. But when we disrupt these 30%, well, the whole world then realizes how scandalous this is. And so we've seen that in 2008. So what goes through this is maize, wheat, rice, etc. But what I eat on a day-to-day basis is meal and sorghum. And we've seen people marching to stand up against these methods. But the major part of our food circulates in family farms and local producers. And this goes through short distance systems and show the diversity of what we have. So more than 70% of the world's food circulates inside a system that is not this global market, and that is trying to go through the territorial markets that are related. And so there's this triangle between production, transformation, processing, and the market, and so the socialization space and richness and wealth distribution lies inside this triangle. So to me, the questions are, what market are we talking about? Who dominates it? Who controls it? And so the temptation is that this global market should control the food market and feed everyone, but this is not what it's about. So it disrupts the whole structure. So the will that we have to disrupt the global food system that I've just mentioned is different from what we have in our local villages in France, in Mali, in Guatemala, in extra-urban circles. These are sustainable systems, and they're disrupted, and so we need to tackle resources. Because when we talk about agriculture and the type of agriculture that destroys the environment, this is related to the use of the intense use of water, of chemicals, and of the constitution and the creation of seeds. These things created genetic erosion. And this is related to food diversity. And so we can see that there's a negative impact on this. And to pick an example of Mali, during colonialism, France built in Mali the biggest dam in Africa. And of course, the purpose was to produce cotton. So what does that mean? It means that the intense food production and the major food production that we had there was then transferred to the production and to cotton production. And so this zone that produced cereals then became a rice growing zone and a cotton growing zone. And so we've cut down trees and we started using pesticides. So the disruption of our food systems destroyed itself, and it destroyed farmers and fishermen. And the trees that were cut down used to protect farmers and fishermen because these people know that they need to preserve their environment in order to keep producing the way they produce or getting food the way they get food. So the transformation for this food system that creates wealth that is less distributed is then connected with our territories. And that was an element I wanted to insist on. So who feeds the world? That's this part that is threatened because of the resources concentration on the other aspect. There's another point that I'd like to tackle, and I think I've talked for 12 minutes. There's a certain number of risks. And so who feeds the world if we need to answer that question? I would say these farmers who are increasingly marginalized and who are struggling today to produce food, and they're facing some kind of risks. There are 4 major risks that were mentioned. There's a social risk first, the recognition and the acknowledgement of who feeds who is something that is not obvious. And in my country, Mali, there were huge struggles and fights that were led when you're a fisherman or a farmer in Mali, and when it's written on your passport, well, then you don't get anything. So when you're trying to look for a job, people consider that it's not a proper job by itself. So we need to acknowledge what these jobs are and these professions are. The second thing are the technical risks and the natural hazards. We've talked about climate change, and that's why there are non-sustainable solutions that are being developed, and they're not available yet, and they will disrupt even more that kind of systems. That's the total deforestation, the transformation of ecosystems into laboratories that are not even controllable. The third risk related to the economic risk, related to the destabilization of the funding resources of agriculture, comprising agroforestry, fishing, and farming. So everything is disrupted. So we are seeing that some resources are being privatized. whether they used to be part of the common good. And at the same time, everything is destabilized. And I will finish by saying that we have no other option than change things. And it's not only related to private policies, but it's a mindset, a different mindset, the approach to food. And this should change in terms of best practices and of social, political and economic movements that I'm defending. And so this interaction between the global north and the global south is something absolutely crucial. So who feeds the world? Well, who feeds our world? Otherwise, we're facing a total disaster. So the question of markets, of production, of the enhancement of our jobs, this is something, these elements are absolutely crucial. And this is what I wanted to describe. And these are the elements I think should be supported. So that was my contribution. And thanks very much for all your other contributions. And I think that Mariam is going to add up to our contributions. And I think that this will be crucial for the future of humanity. And thank you very much for your patience and for understanding that I had to talk a little bit more to explain